Hello, we are on the eighth article of faith now, which states that we believe the Bible to be the Word of God as it is translated correctly. We also believe the Book of Mormon to be the Word of God. Before we continue, I have a 8-month-old running around, so if you see or hear a miniature person, that is why. That's my son. Um, so, anyways, with the article of faith, there are two important issues here, so I'm going to do this article in two parts. The first, this one, will be on whether the Bible is translated correctly. The story basically goes that there was a great apostasy after the death of the apostles, with the result that people, particularly the priests who copied the manuscripts, made changes to the Bible, often based on what the Catholic Church wanted it to say, or what the priest thought it should say. The result is a mistranslated Bible with plain and precious things lost, as the Book of Mormon says, and therefore the Bible as it isn't complete for salvation and can't be used alone as guidance from God. The copying of the Bible is often compared to the children's game of telephone, where a phrase is whispered a single time to someone who has to pass it on to the next person as they think that they heard it. And after this process has happened multiple times, it is often distorted and different from the original. If this is what has happened to the Bible, there's definitely a problem. There's also the question of the many different translations available. Doesn't that prove that the Bible has been mistranslated and that men just do what they want with it? But the evidence doesn't bear any of these concerns out. The Old Testament has been greatly supported by the Dead Sea Scrolls, which contain most of the Old Testament and all date before Jesus. In its original language, we have essentially the same thing that Jesus read in his lifetime. And the New Testament has thousands of manuscripts to compare to one another. The earliest fragments date only a few decades after the original was written. We also know that the originals were written within the apostles' lifetimes. Some of Paul's letters were written only a handful of years after the death of Jesus, and the last gospel written, the Gospel of John, was likely written no later than around 90 AD. So, since Jesus died in the early 30s AD, that's only 60 years difference. There were still people alive who had witnessed Jesus' life or that had been converted near the beginning of the church, hearing the gospel firsthand from the apostles. Sometimes you'll hear about the number of textual variants in the New Testament. Critics like Bart Ehrman and others like to throw around criticisms like this, and it's an intimidating number if it's not put in its proper context. Textual variants are the number of differences in the New Testament between each manuscript. The number is high, it's around 400,000. But you need to keep some things in perspective when you hear this number. Word order in Greek is highly arbitrary. There can be literally hundreds of ways to say John loves Mary. Each of these differences would be considered a textual variant, but each and every one means John loves Mary. We also have to remember that things like misspelling, accidental word omissions or additions, the use of synonyms, and other insignificant differences are all considered textual variants. So the question is the quality of these variants. How many are actually significant? And do any of the significant changes affect doctrine? The answer is that only about 1% of the changes are significant, and not a single one changes essential Christian doctrine. That puts the transmission of the New Testament and the Bible in general in a far different category than the game of telephone. It has been faithfully passed down, and we can be sure that what we read in the original language is trustworthy. So what about the many different translations of the English Bible? Well, that's because there are factors like the difficulties of translating from one ancient language to a different current language. The many manuscripts that we have, most of which have been written in the last found in the last couple of centuries, have also helped make the translations more and more accurate to the originals. Mistakes in the King James Bible, which used only 7 manuscripts, with the earliest dated to the 11th century, have been corrected in many current translations that have been using much older manuscripts and many more manuscripts. But still, if you put the quality scholarly translations side by side, including the King James Bible, you'll find that they all say more or less the same thing. They just use different phrases, words, or word order based on what the translators thought was the closest translation, or the variants contained in the manuscripts they were primarily using. Some translations are more word for word, like the KJV or the ESV, while others are more thought for thought, like the NIV. And if you think the different translations prove that there are irreconcilable differences, just read a few of the good ones side by side. You'll get the same thing. Um, I've summed this up fairly simplistically and didn't cover a few important things, so I would recommend getting into this deeper. The first time I really encountered a lot of this information was in The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. I'll also link a sermon given by Dr. Daniel Wallace, who is a leading Greek scholar. And all this information and more points to the fact that the Bible is actually trustworthy, just like Jesus promised when he said that heaven and earth would pass away, but his word would not. If the Bible is trustworthy, then the apparent need for restoration is not so readily acceptable. The Bible contains everything we need and is complete, and we haven't lost plain and precious things. That also means that when Mormon doctrine contradicts the Bible or doesn't fit in with it, it isn't that the Bible was mistranslated. They contradict because Mormon doctrine is false and non biblical.